In June 2026, under oath, before the United States Congress, an investigative journalist said out loud what the CIA spent 50 years trying to make sure you would never hear. Charles Manson was not simply a cult leader. Charles Manson was a product, a documented, funded, deliberately engineered product of a federal behavioral modification program that used human beings as raw material and called it national security research. The documents exist, the congressional testimony is on the record, and the former CIA officer who testified alongside that journalist didn't deny it. He said something that should terrify every single person watching this video right now. The temptation to replicate this program still exists. Not existed. Exists. Present tense. In 2026. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a congressional hearing held 10 days ago that the mainstream media covered for exactly 48 hours before moving on to the next story. Tonight, we don't move on. Tonight, we open every file they tried to burn, and we follow Charles Manson's story back to the place it actually started. Not a California desert, but a federal prison laboratory in the 1950s. This is redacted truth. Before there was helter-skelter, before there was the family, before there was a single night of violence in the California hills, there was a commune that shouldn't have existed at all. A collection of broken, directionless people gathered around a single man who had spent almost his entire adult life inside federal institutions, and who somehow emerged from those institutions with an almost supernatural ability to locate psychological vulnerabilities in other human beings and exploit them with surgical precision. That ability didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't charisma in the conventional sense. People who knew Manson before his time in federal custody described someone fundamentally different from the man who walked out. The transformation happened inside specific facilities, under specific programs, and the documents confirming those programs existed and that they operated inside the exact institutions where Manson spent his formative years were classified for decades and only began surfacing through Freedom of Information requests filed by researchers who spent years being told there was nothing to find. This is where the paper trail begins, and paper trails are the one thing the CIA consistently underestimated. A prison intake form, the name Manson Charles typed across the top, personal details stamped over with the word classified in thick black ink. Charles Manson entered federal custody for the first time as a teenager, and he would spend the better part of the next 15 years cycling through a system that, during exactly that period, was being used as an operational testing ground for behavioral modification experiments run under CIA oversight. This is not coincidence. Declassified MK Ultra documents confirm that federal prison populations were explicitly identified as target subject pools for early experimentation, specifically because prisoners offered what internal memos described as controlled environmental conditions, unavailable in civilian settings. Controlled environmental conditions means walls, means guards, means a population that cannot leave, cannot complain publicly, and cannot easily be believed if they try. It means the perfect laboratory, hidden in plain sight, inside an institution the public already assumed was about punishment rather than experimentation. By the time Manson arrived in San Francisco in the mid-1960s, the city was already the epicenter of a cultural experiment that had its own troubling connections to federal intelligence programs. A fog-covered San Francisco street at night, a lone silhouette under a street lamp, the Haight-Ashbury district in the background. The CIA's own declassified files confirm that San Francisco was a primary operational location for MK Ultra's LSD distribution research, with multiple safe houses established specifically to study the drug's effects on civilian populations without their knowledge or consent. Operation Midnight Climax ran prostitutes who administered LSD to clients, while CIA officers observed behind one-way mirrors. This wasn't fringe experimentation. This was a documented, funded, multi-year program operating in the exact city, during the exact years, when Charles Manson was building his following among the same population of psychologically vulnerable young people the CIA had been studying and, in some cases, dosing for years before Manson ever arrived. The specific techniques being tested in those facilities during those years are documented now in surviving MK Ultra files, and reading them in the context of what Manson later demonstrated is one of the most disturbing exercises in this entire story. A CIA internal memo. The phrase behavioral modification through prolonged isolation, visible above thick black redaction bars. Prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, psychological dependency induction. Techniques designed specifically to break down an individual's existing personality structure and create what internal documents called enhanced receptivity to external direction. That phrase, enhanced receptivity to external direction, is the clinical language for what the rest of the world would eventually watch Charles Manson do to dozens of young people in the California hills. He didn't invent those techniques. He couldn't have. The sophistication required to systematically dismantle another person's psychological autonomy and replace it with absolute loyalty doesn't emerge spontaneously from someone with a 9th-grade education and a string of petty crime convictions. It has to be learned somewhere. The documents point to exactly where. By the time Manson arrived in San Francisco in the mid-1960s, the city was already the epicenter of a cultural experiment that had its own troubling connections to federal intelligence programs. A fog-covered San Francisco street at night, a lone silhouette under a street lamp, the Haight-Ashbury district in the background. The CIA's own declassified files confirmed that San Francisco was a primary operational location for MK Ultra's LSD distribution research, with multiple safe houses established specifically to study the drug's effects on civilian populations without their knowledge or consent. Operation Midnight Climax ran prostitutes who administered LSD to clients, while CIA officers observed behind one-way mirrors. This wasn't fringe experimentation. This was a documented, funded, multi-year program operating in the exact city, during the exact years, when Charles Manson was building his following among the same population of psychologically vulnerable young people the CIA had been studying and, in some cases, dosing for years before Manson ever arrived. The role of LSD in what Manson built cannot be separated from the role of LSD in what the CIA was simultaneously studying, and the overlap is too precise to dismiss as cultural coincidence. A clinical metal tray holding glass LSD vials beside a typewritten experiment log, the language describing dosage and behavioral observation in the same dry procedural tone used for any other government research report. Manson administered LSD to his followers systematically, strategically, and with a sophistication about timing, dosage, and psychological context that researchers who have studied the family consistently describe as remarkable for someone with no formal pharmacological training. What those researchers rarely ask, and what the congressional testimony in June 2026 finally forced into the open, is where Manson acquired that sophistication. Because the specific way Manson used LSD, not recreationally, but as a tool for dissolving psychological resistance and installing new belief systems, mirrors almost exactly the methodology described in classified CIA research documents from the programs he was exposed to during his years in federal custody. The psychiatric evaluation records from Manson's years in federal custody tell a story that becomes dramatically more disturbing when read alongside declassified program documents from the same period. A psychiatric evaluation form, handwritten clinical notes partially redacted, a rubber stamp reading "Federal Prisoner" across the top, the language clinical and detached in the way that makes horror feel bureaucratic. Psychologists who evaluated Manson during his federal years described personality characteristics that evolved in ways clinical literature consistently associates with prolonged exposure to manipulation techniques rather than organic psychological development. The specific progression from a relatively unremarkable juvenile offender to someone displaying what one evaluation described as unusual capacity for interpersonal influence and behavioral direction of others follows a trajectory that matches documented outcomes of behavioral modification, exposure, almost point for point. These evaluations were filed. They were archived. They were accessible to researchers for decades. Nobody connected the timeline until O'Neill spent 20 years doing it. And the CIA spent those same 20 years making sure his findings stayed as far from mainstream attention as institutionally possible. The psychiatric evaluation records from Manson's years in federal custody tell a story that becomes dramatically more disturbing when read alongside declassified program documents from the same period. A psychiatric evaluation form, handwritten clinical notes partially redacted, a rubber stamp reading "Federal Prisoner" across the top, the language clinical and detached in the way that makes horror feel bureaucratic. Psychologists who evaluated Manson during his federal years described personality characteristics that evolved in ways clinical literature consistently associates with prolonged exposure to manipulation techniques rather than organic psychological development. The specific progression from a relatively unremarkable juvenile offender to someone displaying what one evaluation described as unusual capacity for interpersonal influence and behavioral direction of others follows a trajectory that matches documented outcomes of behavioral modification, exposure, almost point for point. These evaluations were filed. They were archived. They were accessible to researchers for decades. Nobody connected the timeline until O'Neill spent 20 years doing it. And the CIA spent those same 20 years making sure his findings stayed as far from mainstream attention as institutionally possible. The physical location where the family eventually settled tells its own story about how carefully this entire operation was constructed, whether by design or by the momentum of everything that had preceded it. A remote desert ranch at dawn, dilapidated wooden structures barely visible against a pale morning sky, barbed wire catching the first light, the kind of isolation that makes whatever happens inside invisible to whatever exists outside. Spahn Ranch was not chosen randomly. Its isolation was its primary function. What Manson built there in the years between his release from federal custody and the summer of 1969 was a closed system that replicated almost exactly the controlled environmental conditions described in CIA behavioral modification research as optimal for achieving complete psychological compliance in subject populations. A controlled physical environment, controlled access to information, controlled social relationships, controlled substance administration. The documents describing ideal conditions for behavioral modification programs and the physical reality of what Manson constructed in that California desert are so structurally similar that researchers who have studied both consistently describe the overlap as impossible to attribute entirely to coincidence. The recordings made inside Spahn Ranch tell a story no written document can fully capture, and the fact that most of them were destroyed before anyone with real authority could examine them is not an accident. A reel-to-reel tape recorder running in a dim room, tape slowly turning, a single microphone on the table. FBI surveillance logs confirm that Manson was under intermittent federal observation during periods when his behavior should have triggered immediate intervention. It didn't. Requests filed under the Freedom of Information Act for surveillance records from those specific periods have returned responses that researchers describe as unusually consistent. Records either don't exist, were destroyed under routine retention schedules, or remain classified under exemptions that don't expire. When federal surveillance of a man who will eventually be convicted of orchestrating multiple murders produces records that are either missing or permanently sealed, the absence of evidence becomes evidence of something far more disturbing than anything the documents themselves might contain. The trial that put Charles Manson in prison for the rest of his life answered almost none of the questions that mattered most. An empty 1960s courtroom, a single shaft of light on the vacant defendant's chair, benches stretching back into shadow. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi built his case around the helter-skelter motive. A race war Manson allegedly believed the murders would trigger. It was a motive the jury accepted. It was also a motive that conveniently required no examination of Manson's federal history, no scrutiny of the institutions that shaped him, and no questions about why a man with his background possessed capabilities that had no obvious origin. Bugliosi was a brilliant prosecutor. But the case he prosecuted was the case that could be proven in 1970, with the evidence available in 1970. The case that couldn't be prosecuted then, the case about what was done to Charles Manson before he did anything to anyone else. That case has been waiting 50 years for a courtroom willing to hear it. The physical evidence that connects Manson's story to something larger than one man's psychology exists in fragments scattered across 50 years of investigative work. A hand holding a photograph of a California hillside, crime scene markers barely visible in the distance, a magnifying glass resting on top. Investigative journalist Tom O'Neill spent 2 decades locating those fragments, cross-referencing Manson's documented institutional timeline against declassified CIA program records and building a case that the mainstream publishing industry rejected repeatedly before it finally reached print. What O'Neill found wasn't a smoking gun document with Manson's name on a CIA payroll. It was something more structurally damning, a pattern of overlapping timelines, connected personnel, and institutional relationships that made the official story that Manson's capabilities emerged entirely from his own psychology, increasingly impossible to defend with a straight face against the documentary record. The summer of 1969 didn't begin with violence. It began with a decision, made somewhere by someone, that the experiment had run its course. A Los Angeles neighborhood street at night, police tape across a driveway, emergency lights turning wet, pavement red and blue. What happened in August 1969 was the visible end of something whose beginning remains deliberately obscured. Researchers who have spent years examining the timeline of events leading to the Tate and LaBianca murders consistently identify a period in the months immediately preceding them, during which Manson's behavior shifted in ways that don't fit neatly into the helter-skelter narrative. Decisions were made, targets were selected, instructions were given and followed with a precision that speaks to something more organized than a group of drug-addled commune members acting on apocalyptic fantasy. The question of who made those decisions and whether any of those decisions originated outside the ranch is the question the 1970 trial was never designed to answer. This is the document that breaks the official story open. A CIA page, the redaction bar peeling at the corner, typed text visible underneath reading, "Subject demonstrated complete behavioral compliance." Complete behavioral compliance. That phrase appears in MK Ultra operational documents to describe the successful outcome of a behavioral modification sequence. A subject who will act on external instruction without independent moral evaluation of that instruction. It is the clinical description of exactly what Charles Manson achieved with his followers. And it appears in a document whose timeline, facility references, and subject designation codes overlap with records from Manson's federal custody period in ways that Tom O'Neill spent 20 years documenting and the CIA spent 20 years dismissing. The document doesn't prove everything, but it proves enough that a congressional committee in 2026 decided it warranted sworn testimony. And that decision alone tells you more than the CIA has ever voluntarily admitted about this story. After the murders, the institutions that should have asked the hardest questions asked almost none of them. A federal courthouse exterior at dusk, stone columns throwing deep shadows, a lone silhouette on the steps. The FBI's investigation of Manson focused entirely on building a prosecutable criminal case, which is what the FBI exists to do. What it doesn't exist to do, and what nobody with institutional authority chose to do in 1969 or 1970, was examine the prior federal history of the man at the center of that criminal case with any serious scrutiny. Internal FBI documents released decades later confirm that agents were aware of Manson's federal institutional history and his presence in locations connected to documented intelligence programs. That awareness was noted, it was filed, and it was not pursued. Whether that decision was made deliberately, bureaucratically, or under pressure from another agency whose interests would not have been served by that particular line of inquiry, the documents don't specify. The gap where the answer should be is its own kind of answer. The people who tried to tell this story before O'Neill found themselves blocked at every turn by a system that had become very good at making inconvenient research disappear quietly. A worn prison visitation log, one entry circled in faded ink, names around it partially obscured. Researchers who filed FOIA requests for specific Manson-related federal records during the 1980s and 1990s reported experiences that followed a consistent pattern. Initial acknowledgement, followed by delays measured in years, followed by responses indicating that relevant records either didn't exist or had been destroyed under standard retention schedules. Several researchers who were making genuine progress reported what they described as coordinated interference. Sources who stopped returning calls, documents that vanished from archives between one visit and the next, professional reputations quietly damaged through channels that left no fingerprints. This is how institutional suppression works in practice, not dramatically, not through obvious intimidation, through patience, bureaucracy, and the quiet application of pressure in places where pressure is hardest to prove. The academic community that should have examined these questions chose, almost without exception, not to. A 1960s university psychology laboratory, empty clinical equipment, behavioral diagrams on a chalkboard, the kind of room where the science that was later weaponized inside federal institutions was originally developed and taught. Psychologists and criminologists who built careers studying Manson consistently produced analyses that accepted the boundaries of the official record without questioning whether those boundaries had been deliberately constructed. The helter-skelter narrative was academically convenient. It explained everything without requiring examination of anything the CIA would have preferred remain unexamined. Researchers who pushed beyond those boundaries found their work dismissed as conspiracy theory before it could be seriously evaluated. The label did its job. It kept the questions inside a box marked fringe for 50 years, right up until a congressional committee decided in 2026 that the questions deserved sworn testimony instead. The files that would answer the remaining questions definitively still exist somewhere. Hands sorting through a classified FBI folder, documents partially visible, a red stamp reading "Do not duplicate" across the top sheet. Researchers who testified before the 2026 Congressional Task Force presented a specific list of records: facility logs, personnel files, program documentation, and surveillance records, whose existence can be confirmed through secondary references in already declassified material, but whose contents remain sealed under classification levels that have not been lowered despite 50 years of requests. These aren't hypothetical documents. They are real files whose existence is proven by the paper trail around them, sitting in federal archives behind classification walls that have survived every administration, every congressional push, and every court order that has ever been directed at them. The 2026 hearing was the first time a body with actual subpoena power decided those walls needed to come down. What happens next determines whether they actually do. And then came the moment nobody in the intelligence community wanted. A congressional hearing with real authority, real witnesses, and a public record that couldn't be quietly buried the way everything before it had been. The U.S. Capitol silhouetted against a stormy night sky, lightning splitting the clouds above it. The weight of 50 years of suppressed history pressing against walls that were finally, visibly starting to crack. The House Oversight Committee's task force on declassification of federal secrets convened in late June 2026, specifically to examine the connection between MK Ultra and the Manson case, among other classified programs. This wasn't a fringe hearing attended by 3 senators and ignored by the press. This was a formal congressional proceeding with subpoena power, sworn witnesses, and a public livestream that pulled over 800,000 views on Forbes breaking news alone within 7 days. The story had finally reached a room powerful enough to demand answers. Whether that room would actually get them is the question the next 10 minutes will answer. What the witnesses said under oath in that hearing room in June 2026 cannot be walked back, and the people who spent 50 years making sure this testimony never happened understand exactly what that means. A congressional witness table, the nameplate reading, Tom O'Neill, investigative journalist, microphones lined up in front of an empty chair. O'Neill's testimony lasted over 2 hours. He presented a documented timeline connecting Manson's federal institutional history to MK Ultra operational periods, with a specificity that no previous public forum had ever allowed. He named facilities. He named personnel. He described a pattern of records destruction that mirrored exactly the 1973 destruction of MK Ultra files. Same methodology, same justifications, same result. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that changes the shape of everything that came before it. The CIA representatives present did not refute his documents. They questioned his conclusions. There is a significant difference between those two things, and everyone in that room understood exactly what that difference meant. The Senate has heard versions of this story before, and every previous time the walls held. A 1970s Senate hearing room, rows of empty seats, a spotlight on the central podium, the flag standing still in the background. The Church Committee in 1975 came closest to exposing the full scope of what MK Ultra had produced. But Richard Helms had already ordered the file destruction 2 years earlier, and the witnesses who appeared before that committee had 50 years less public documentation to contradict them with. The 2026 hearing was different in one fundamental way. The researchers who testified had access to decades of FOIA releases, declassified documents, and investigative journalism that the 1975 committee never had. The walls that held in 1975 were built to withstand a different kind of pressure than what arrived in that hearing room in June 2026. Whether they held this time is still being determined. But for the first time in 50 years, there are people with subpoena power who are genuinely trying to find out. The book that started this entire congressional conversation almost didn't get published at all. A copy of Chaos, Charles Manson and the CIA, resting on a desk beside classified documents, a raking light catching the cover. Tom O'Neill spent 24 years researching and writing that book. He began as a journalist assigned to write a straightforward anniversary piece about the Manson murders for a magazine. What he found in the first months of that assignment convinced him the official story had fundamental gaps. What he found in the following 2 decades convinced him those gaps were not accidental. Publishers who received early versions of the manuscript raised concerns about legal exposure. Sources who had spoken openly early in his research became suddenly unreachable. Documents he had photographed in archives were no longer available when he returned to verify them, The book that finally emerged in 2019 was the result of 2 decades of research that the institutional forces surrounding this story worked consistently, if not always visibly, to prevent from ever reaching a reader. The building where the final decisions about this story are still being made looks exactly like every other federal building in Washington, and that anonymity is entirely intentional. A CIA headquarters-style building at night, one window lit on an upper floor, every other window dark. Inside buildings like this one, right now, there are analysts and attorneys reviewing exactly what was released in the 2026, hearing and calculating what the next disclosure request will be able to reach and what classification walls will hold against it. This is not paranoia. This is documented institutional behavior, consistent across 50 years of responses to every serious inquiry into MKUltra and its connected programs. The CIA does not respond to pressure by opening its files. It responds by identifying the minimum disclosure that will relieve the immediate pressure while protecting everything that matters most. That strategy has worked for half a century. The 2026 hearing represents the most serious challenge it has ever faced. The response is already being prepared in rooms exactly like this one. The files that would close this case permanently are real, located, and currently inaccessible. A hand sliding a folder marked Manson Behavioral Program. Eyes only, across a government table, the paper catching light as it moves. Researchers who testified in 2026 were able to identify through secondary document references at least 14 specific files whose existence is confirmed, but whose contents remain classified. These aren't speculative documents. They are real files with real archive numbers, sitting in federal storage facilities whose locations are known, behind classification designations that have survived every legal challenge ever directed at them. The Congressional Task Force issued formal requests for those 14 files as part of the June 2026 hearing process. The agency response, delivered within 30 days as required by procedure, acknowledged the existence of the files and cited ongoing national security concerns as the basis for continued classification. 50 years after the murders, 30 years after Manson's death, the files that explain what he was before he became what history remembers are still not yours to read. The archive that should hold the complete answer to this story is defined, like every archive connected to MKUltra, by what is missing rather than what remains. A government archive room, filing cabinets stretching into darkness, one drawer standing completely empty. The destruction of records in 1973 was not a single event. It was a multi-week process conducted across multiple facilities simultaneously, coordinated by people who understood exactly which documents posed the greatest institutional risk. Researchers who have spent decades reconstructing what was destroyed through secondary references estimate that the surviving MKUltra record represents somewhere between 10 and 15% of the original documentation. The Manson-connected material, which would have been among the most operationally sensitive in the entire program, would have been among the first destroyed. What survives does so because it was filed incorrectly, forgotten, or considered too procedurally mundane to prioritize for destruction. The most important pages in this story burned in 1973. We are reading the footnotes of a book that no longer exists. The scientists who built the program that may have produced Charles Manson are all dead now. And they died without ever being asked the right questions in a room with real consequences. A burned document in a metal ashtray, one surviving line of typed text, barely readable through the char. Sidney Gottlieb, the architect of MKUltra, appeared before the Church Committee in 1977 and provided testimony that researchers, who have since compared it against declassified documents, describe as carefully constructed to be technically accurate, while revealing almost nothing of operational significance. He retired with a full pension. He moved to a farm in Virginia. He died in 1999 at the age of 80, having never faced criminal charges for any aspect of the programs he ran. The 25 prisoners experimented on under Project Bluebird had no names in the official record. The people who ran the programs that shaped Charles Manson had names, careers, pensions, and obituaries that described distinguished public service. That imbalance is not a footnote. It is the entire moral weight of this story, compressed into a single unbearable fact. Here is where the story stands today, in the summer of 2026, and today is more unresolved than the 50-year gap between then and now should have allowed. Storm clouds parting over a California desert at twilight, a single beam of light breaking through onto empty scrubland, the landscape where the visible end of this story played out in August 1969. The congressional hearing happened. The testimony is on the record. The documents O'Neill presented have not been refuted. The former CIA officer's statement about the temptation to replicate MKUltra's methods has not been walked back or clarified. And the 14 files whose existence was confirmed and whose contents remain classified are still sitting in federal storage behind walls that have not moved. The light breaking through those storm clouds is real, but it is illuminating the surface of something whose full depth has never been measured, because every time anyone gets close enough to measure it, a classification wall appears exactly where the measurement would matter most. The witness chair that may finally force this story to its conclusion sat empty for 50 years. A former CIA officer's empty chair at a congressional hearing table, a glass of water untouched, a nameplate face down. The task force that convened in June 2026 has subpoena power that previous investigations did not. Subpoena power means compelled testimony. It means witnesses cannot simply decline to appear. It means documents cannot simply be described as destroyed without someone swearing under oath to that destruction and accepting personal legal liability for that sworn statement. This is a fundamentally different legal environment than anything this story has previously operated in. Whether the people who hold the remaining answers will be compelled to give them, whether the classification walls protecting the most sensitive material will be ordered down by a court with jurisdiction to do so, whether the 14 confirmed files will ever be read by anyone outside the authorization chain. Those questions are being answered right now, in real time, in proceedings that are still active as this video goes to air. And this is the sentence that should stay with you. The sentence spoken under oath before the United States Congress in June 2026 by a former officer of the Central Intelligence Agency on the record, with cameras running, in a room full of elected officials with subpoena power. A single typed line on a blacked-out classified page, moonlight falling directly onto the words. The temptation to replicate this program still exists. Not existed. Exists. That word is carrying 50 years of everything this story contains. It means the methodology works. It means the people who know it works have considered using it again. It means that whatever Charles Manson was before he became what history remembers, whatever was done to him inside federal institutions that turned a petty criminal into something that could direct other human beings to kill without hesitation or remorse, that process has not been forgotten by the people who would know. The files are not all open. The program is not fully dismantled. And somewhere in a building whose location you are not cleared to know, someone with the right authorization is reading documents that would answer every question this video has raised and has absolutely no intention of sharing them with you. The story isn't over. It's just still classified.